I was 20 when I agreed to house sit for my aunt and uncle while they went on a 2-week vacation. Their place was a beautiful but isolated cabin at the edge of a lake, with woods surrounding it on all sides. The nearest neighbor was nearly a mile down the dirt road, and cell service was spotty at best. At first, I thought it would be a peaceful getaway, just me, the lake, and a couple of good books. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time kayaking, reading on the deck, and soaking in the quiet. But by the fourth night, that tranquility turned into unease. It started with noises, faint rustling sounds coming from the woods. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons or deer maybe, but the sounds didn't stop. Around midnight, I heard something heavier than any small animal thudding around outside, followed by what sounded like whispering. I turned off all the lights and peered out the window. Moonlight illuminated the clearing around the cabin, but I didn't see anything unusual. Still, I locked all the doors and windows, my heart pounding. The next morning, I brushed it off. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. After all, I was a city kid, not used to the eerie quiet of the woods. That evening, I was sitting by the fire when I noticed something strange. The wind chimes my aunt had hung on the porch were perfectly still despite a light breeze. They swayed gently, but no sound came from them, as if something had silenced them. I shook my head and laughed nervously. "I'm losing it," I muttered to myself. But then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Every hair on my body stood up. No one should have been out there, not this far from town, not at that hour. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing but the empty porch. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. Silence answered me. I locked the door and retreated to the kitchen, trying to calm myself. But then came another knock, this time from the back door. Heart racing, I grabbed a knife from the counter and forced myself to look outside. Again, there was nothing there, just the woods and the lake shimmering faintly in the moonlight. By now, I was done trying to rationalize things. I locked myself in the bedroom, barricaded the door with a chair, and sat awake until dawn, listening for more sounds. The next day, I called my aunt and uncle. "Everything's fine," I lied, not wanting to worry them. But as soon as the call ended, I packed my things and decided I'd sleep in my car if I had to. That night, just as I was about to leave, I heard it again, whispering right outside the cabin window. It was close, too close. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to look, but what I saw made my blood freeze. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, its face obscured by shadow, but I could tell it was watching me. And then it did something I will never forget. It raised a hand and slowly waved. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for my car, locked the doors, and sped down that dirt road without looking back. The next day, I returned only to grab the rest of my things, accompanied by a friend. There was no sign of anyone near the cabin, no footprints, no disturbances, just eerie silence. I never told my aunt and uncle what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Something was out there that night. I was heading home after visiting a friend who lived about 40 minutes away in a rural area. It was close to midnight and the roads were eerily quiet. The highway was under construction, so I had to take a back road through a wooded area. There weren't any streetlights, and the only thing illuminating the road ahead was my high beams cutting through the dense fog. About 10 minutes in, I noticed a small wooden sign on the side of the road. It was tilted, covered in moss, but I could still make out the words. "Detour ahead." I slowed down, following the arrow pointing to a narrow dirt path. It didn't look like an official detour, but there wasn't anywhere else to go. As I drove, the road became rougher, with potholes and tree branches scraping against my car. I kept checking my phone for directions, but I had no signal. I was getting more and more uneasy when I saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like headlights. Relieved, I sped up a bit, hoping to catch up to another vehicle. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't headlights. It was a lantern swinging side to side, held by a man walking down the middle of the road. I slowed down to a crawl, my stomach knotting up. He wasn't moving out of the way. He just stood there staring at my car as I came to a stop. He was tall, wearing tattered clothes that looked soaked from the misty air. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. I rolled down my window just a crack and called out, "Do you need help?" He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. I was about to drive around him when he raised his hand and pointed to the woods on my left. I don't know why, but something about that gesture made my skin crawl. It was too deliberate, too slow. I shook my head and said, "I'm sorry. I can't help you." That's when he stepped closer. Panicking, I rolled up my window and shifted into reverse, ready to back up. But as soon as I looked in my rearview mirror, my heart stopped. There was another figure standing right behind my car. This one was smaller, hunched over, and holding something long, a stick, maybe, or a pole, I couldn't tell. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, unsure of what to do. Then the man with the lantern tapped on my window. It wasn't a hard knock, just a soft, rhythmic tapping. I turned to look at him, and he leaned down, bringing his face level with mine. His eyes, they were wrong. They didn't reflect the light from the lantern. They were just dark, empty sockets. I screamed, slamming the gas pedal, not caring if I hit the person behind me. My car jolted forward as the engine roared, and I swerved wildly to avoid the man with the lantern. I could hear something hit the side of my car, but I didn't stop to check. I sped down the dirt road, heart pounding, until I finally saw a highway sign in the distance. My phone buzzed as it regained signal, and I called the police, telling them everything. When they arrived, they found nothing. No signs, no lantern, no figures. The officer said the road I described didn't even exist on their maps. I drove the same route the next day in daylight, but the detour sign and dirt path were gone. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I'll never forget those empty eyes and the sound of that rhythmic tapping on my window. It was one of those late summer nights when the heat refuses to leave, even after dark. I was working the night shift at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Not many people came through at this hour, but there was always the occasional trucker or traveler passing through. Around 1 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, and a man stepped in. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket despite the oppressive heat, and his face was partially obscured by a baseball cap. He glanced around before sitting at the counter, his back to the door. I was cleaning the counter when he finally spoke up, his voice low but clear. "Black coffee," he said. I nodded and got to work, trying not to stare. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I made his coffee, and when I set it down in front of him, he didn't look up. He just kept staring straight ahead, his fingers gripping the mug a little too tightly. I tried to go back to my cleaning, but it felt like there was a weight in the air, like someone was watching me. I glanced up at him and saw that he was still staring straight ahead. It was almost as if he wasn't aware of anything around him. The bell over the door jingled again, and I turned to see another man walking in. He was shorter, with unkempt hair and a tired expression. He didn't even acknowledge me as he sat down a few stools away from the first man. It was then that I noticed something strange. The first man's posture was rigid, unnaturally so. His back was straight, but his hands were shaking slightly, almost imperceptibly. The second man ordered a coffee as well, and I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. I couldn't pinpoint it, but the whole scene had this eerie, unsettling vibe to it. The second man's coffee came, but as I turned to walk back to the counter, I caught a glimpse of the first man's reflection in the window. His eyes were wide, but they weren't looking at anything in particular. It was as though he was seeing something else, something only he could see. I froze, my heart pounding. The second man, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, suddenly glanced over at the first man. His eyes locked on him for a brief second. Then he turned his gaze back to the counter, never acknowledging that anything had happened. I couldn't stand it anymore. "Is everything okay?" I asked the first man, my voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes snapped to mine, and for the briefest moment there was something unsettling in his gaze. Something deep, something hollow. "Fine," he muttered. His voice was strangely distant, as if he wasn't really talking to me. "Everything's fine." I took a step back, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. A few minutes passed, and the diner was oddly quiet. The second man finished his coffee and stood up, leaving some change on the counter. He didn't look at either of us as he walked out into the night, leaving the door to jingle behind him. But the first man didn't move. He sat there, staring ahead, unmoving. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow waiting for something, or someone. I went back to cleaning, but every few seconds, I glanced over at him. His hands were still trembling, his eyes still unfocused. Then, the strangest thing happened. The door jingled again. I looked up, expecting another customer, but the bell had rung too quickly, too suddenly. There was no one standing there. The first man stood up then, but not like someone who had just decided to leave. He moved slowly, stiffly, like he was trying to rise from some kind of paralysis. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his movements were jerky, unnatural. I watched, frozen, as he walked toward the door. It was as if he was being pulled by something invisible. When he reached the door, he stopped. He turned around to face me, and for a brief second I could swear I saw his mouth twitch in a grim smile. Then he left. I didn't move. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of something scraping against the pavement outside. I hesitated, then peeked through the window. There was nothing there. I didn't work the night shift much after that. And to this day, I still wonder what happened that night, who the man was, and why I never saw him again. It was just after 1:30 a.m. when I stumbled back to my apartment after a night out with friends. I wasn't blackout drunk, but I'd had enough to feel disoriented and sluggish. The air was cold, and the streets were eerily quiet as I fumbled with the keypad to unlock the front door of my building. My fingers were clumsy, and it took longer than usual, but eventually, I made it inside and dragged myself up the stairs to my unit. The moment I stepped through the door, I tossed my jacket and keys onto the floor and collapsed onto the couch. My head was buzzing, and a faint nausea was starting to creep in, so I stayed still, staring at the dark ceiling and hoping it would pass. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is the sound of a faint knock on the door. It was soft at first, almost polite, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I checked my phone. 2:04 a.m. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was someone at the wrong door, or maybe it was just one of the neighbors messing around. But the knocking didn't stop. It turned into pounding. Reluctantly, I got up, shuffled toward the peephole, and squinted through it. The hallway light was dim, but I could make out a tall figure standing unnervingly still, their face obscured by the hood of a jacket. They weren't moving, just standing there, hand raised mid-knock like they were waiting for me to respond. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice wavering more than I liked. No response. They just stood there. A creeping unease began to settle over me, and I instinctively checked the deadbolt. Locked. I took a step back, trying to decide what to do next, when I heard something that sent a chill straight through me. A faint tapping sound coming from the balcony door on the opposite side of the apartment. My blood ran cold. I lived on the 3rd floor, and there was no fire escape. No one should be out there. Slowly, I turned toward the balcony. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faintest silhouette of movement behind them. Someone, or something, was out there. The pounding on the front door grew louder, more frantic, as the tapping on the glass became scratching, like nails dragging against the surface. My breath hitched. I didn't know what to do. My phone was still on the couch, out of reach, and I couldn't bring myself to move. Suddenly, the pounding on the front door stopped. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. A low, deliberate creak echoed from the hallway as though someone was turning the handle, testing it. But the door was locked, wasn't it? I was sure I'd locked it. The scratching on the balcony door turned into a sharp, deliberate knock. Whatever was out there was no longer trying to be subtle. My heart was hammering so loudly I thought it might burst. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Then everything stopped. The knocking, the scratching, the creaking, silence. For a moment, I thought maybe they'd given up and left, but the relief was short-lived. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow slipping past the crack at the bottom of the front door, moving toward the living room window. I darted to the couch, grabbing my phone with trembling hands and dialing 911. As I explained the situation to the operator, I heard the faint sound of the balcony door sliding open. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't even realized it was unlocked. The operator's voice urged me to stay calm and hide, but before I could move, a cold draft swept through the apartment. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel it, the presence, standing behind me watching. "Hello," a voice whispered, low and raspy, far too close for comfort. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the open balcony door, curtains swaying in the wind. My phone slipped from my hand as I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks until it finally gave way. I ran into the hallway, slamming the door behind me and not stopping until I was outside, surrounded by streetlights and the faint hum of the city. When the police arrived, they found the balcony door wide open, but no signs of forced entry and nothing stolen. The only thing they noticed was a single handprint on the glass, too large to belong to anyone I knew. It was late November, and I was working the night shift at a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The place was always dead at night, just a few truckers passing through, maybe a couple of people staying for a night or two, but on this particular night, things felt different. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old building creak. The rain had started around midnight, pouring down in sheets. I'd been working alone for a few hours, but as the clock struck 2 a.m. I felt like I was being watched. There had been no one in the lobby for hours, and the silence was almost unbearable. Just as I was starting to think I might be imagining things, the door swung open with a soft chime. A man stepped inside, drenched from the rain. He was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the hood. He was wet and shivering, his clothes sticking to his skin. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my heart was beating faster. The man didn't answer right away. He just stood there looking around the lobby. His eyes seemed empty, distant, like he wasn't seeing anything at all. I repeated the question, and finally he looked at me. "A room." "I need a room," he said, his voice low and raspy. I gave him a key to one of the empty rooms, and he took it without another word, disappearing down the hallway. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. About an hour later, I was cleaning up behind the counter when I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps coming down the hall. I glanced up, expecting to see the man, but no one appeared. The footsteps continued, growing louder until they were right outside the lobby. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up quickly, scanning the hallway through the small window in the door. But there was no one there. The footsteps stopped. There was a brief moment of silence, and then the door to the office slowly creaked open. The man stood in the doorway, staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "I can't stay here," he said, his voice shaking now. "I need to leave." "Why, what's wrong?" I asked, feeling my skin crawl. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, his gaze darting nervously. Then he stepped closer to the counter, and in a hushed voice, he said, "It's in the room with me. It's been watching me." I froze, unsure of how to react. "What do you mean, who's watching you?" He shook his head frantically, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "I don't know, I just know it's there. I can feel it. It's been watching me ever since I walked in." The air in the lobby seemed to grow colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a strange sense of dread wash over me, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Okay," I said slowly, "maybe you should just sit down for a minute. Let's talk about it." Before I could say anything else, the man bolted for the door. I stood frozen for a second, but then instinct kicked in and I rushed to the window to watch him leave. He was running toward the parking lot, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. But just as he reached the door, I noticed something strange. A shadow appeared behind him, moving unnaturally fast, darting from one side of the parking lot to the other. It didn't look like a person. It was too fast, too fluid. I watched as the man reached his car, but before he could open the door, the shadow lunged at him. He screamed, a high-pitched, frantic scream that cut through the night like a knife. The next few moments were a blur. He was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign of the shadow that had followed him. The parking lot was empty, silent once more. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I couldn't stay in that motel another minute. I called the police, but when they arrived, there was no evidence of the man ever having been there. The only thing they found was a single muddy footprint leading from the parking lot to the road. It stopped abruptly, as though the person who had made it had simply vanished into thin air. I don't know what happened that night, or who, or what that man had been running from, but I've never worked another night shift there since. And sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I hear footsteps behind me. I don't turn around,